students type in St. Michael and All Angels Bampton, you will find this jolly vicar standing there, and there are 2 sermons up at the moment, Ephesians chapter 5 and Ephesians chapter 6, and we're going to add this afternoon this one as well. So you can relive the amazing sermons at your own comfort, pausing and fast forwarding as you wish. Don't you wish you could do that now? Don't answer that. So we've got a 5-week study of one of the most famous books of the Bible, apart from the Gospels, I guess, Isaiah. Isaiah is in the Old Testament. I know you did not need me to tell you that, but I just want you to consider what you think of the Old Testament. What do I think of the Old Testament? Because let's face it, Christians in the Church of England in the 21st century are quite happy to take hold of the promises of the Gospels, of the forgiving Jesus, of the compassionate God. But like me, I'm sure you've been challenged by people who've said, how can you believe in the God of the Old Testament? The wrathful God, the jealous God who punishes, the God who oversees wars, raises up nations and casts them down. Christian men and women, do you believe in that God? So what would your answer be if somebody asked you about that? Consider that. I want you to keep thinking about that, especially as we cover Isaiah over the next 5 weeks, starting with this one. So I guess we should have started at chapter 1, so we did, even though it's quite a difficult chapter to start with. There are some challenging words from the prophet Isaiah as he speaks the word of God to the royal court, to the temples, to the people. Isaiah must have been somebody who was part of the establishment, because in that first verse of Isaiah, have you got your Bibles with you? No, don't worry, I have. So that first verse tells us a lot about Isaiah. The vision concerning Judah and Jerusalem that Isaiah, son of Amos, saw during the reigns of, and this is how they would locate their history in time, according to who was reigning at the time. Here they are: Uzziah, Jotham, Ahaz, and Hezekiah. Heard of any of those? Good. There's a few names ringing out. Excellent. 4 kings. That's a very long time. That first verse tells you that Isaiah was attached to the royal court, knew of the kings, and that there was a long period of his ministry. Actually, there was a 5th one as well, Manasseh. And I guess we don't hear about him so much because he didn't like Isaiah, and I can prove that because Manasseh had Isaiah sawed in half. And that's probably why he's not mentioned in that first verse. It didn't really click with Isaiah. You'll remember that God brought out the Hebrews from Egypt and slavery. You'll remember that there was a promised land which they had to fight for. You'll probably remember that in Deuteronomy there are promises of God's love, promises of their prosperity, of a land and of a place where they wouldn't have to use tents anymore, but they could build a city that would become a light to the nations. This is the compassionate God. This is the loving God who has a contract, a covenant, an old covenant with the people. They didn't see it as the old covenant, they just saw it as the promise. On the people's part, they had to be the ones who worshipped. They had to be the ones who followed the rituals, who loved God, who praised God, who gave God the first fruits, the best of their harvest, not the leftovers. They had to abide by the rules of right living, righteousness, peace, and justice. That's not a bad that contract. That covenant says God will bring them prosperity and an identity and a land, and all they had to do was follow and trust God. We also know from the book of Kings 1 and 2, and the book of Chronicles 1 and 2, that they didn't always do that. And there were some kings who upheld those truths and drove the people forward in faith, and it was excellent, and other kings who were appalling and simply allowed the people to wander and drift, to have other gods, to not practice fairness in life. The day-to-day things of life, like the trading and the scales used, the boundaries of their territories, the way the foreigner or the vulnerable was treated. All of those little day-to-day things were evidence stacked up against God's people. Verse 2 of chapter 1. Hear, O heavens, listen, O earth, for the Lord has spoken. Notice, God is calling the heavens and the earth as witnesses against the people of God. I reared children and brought them up, but they have rebelled against me. That term rebellion is throughout the Old Testament, especially in the prophets, how God's people rebel, they fight against God. The ox knows his master, the donkey his owner's manager, but Israel does not know. My people do not understand. Ah, sinful nation, a people loaded with guilt, a brood of evildoers, children given to corruption. They have forsaken the Lord, and they have spurned the Holy One of Israel and turned their backs on him. There is the charge. Why do you think people ignore God? Is it because they have more important things to do in their lives? Hold on a second. God, who created them, who created the universe, has a plan. Isn't that the most important thing? Why do people ignore God? Is it because they imagine God to be the vengeful, wrathful God who's going to punish them for everything that they do wrong, and so they are afraid of God? Why do people ignore God? Is it because we're lazy? Why should you be beaten anymore? Why do you persist in rebellion? Your whole head is injured, your whole heart afflicted. This is very colourful language now. It talks of the damage in life that has come to God's chosen people. And in effect, what God is saying through Isaiah is, it's not working, is it? All of these hints, challenges and punishments are simply not working. Your country is desolate. Your cities burned with fire. Your fields are being stripped by foreigners right before you, laid waste as when overthrown by strangers. Now, a little more history here, because there's another very important strand in Isaiah, the history. So we mentioned those 4 kings, and there needs to be a bit of a conversation now about nations. All through the promised land, they're gathering the promised land to Israel, had to fight. And eventually, through the hand of God, they subdued those who were the owners there in Canaan. The Canaanites, the Philistines were pushed back. But through the decades and centuries, there were constant squabbles and conflicts. The Philistines, boo. There are also very large armies and nations like the Egyptians who ebbed and flowed, the Babylonians and the Assyrians. And in Isaiah, in the middle bit, there's an important episode where Hezekiah is attacked by the Assyrian army, Sennacherib. And Sennacherib, as the Assyrians, have swept through and destroyed the northern kingdom. And I'm skipping over quite a bit of history here. Basically, the United Kingdom of Israel under King Saul, the first king, and then the famous king, King David, split into two, the northern Israel and the southern Judah. And it's Judah from where we get the word Jewish, Judaism. Well, the northern kingdom got attacked by Assyria and swept away. Lots of the folks from Israel were taken up into exile. And there's another important historical landmark. And Sennacherib's Assyrian army, 180,000 of them, parked themselves outside of Jerusalem, and everyone in Jerusalem panicked. Of course they did. Hezekiah was the king, and there's a great bit in the middle of Isaiah that talks about how he made bargains with Egypt and paid a ransom, and he prayed. And his prayer was heard by God. Now, Lord Byron wrote a poem called The Destruction of Sennacherib. And I'm going to try not to read it all, but it is good stuff. Here it is. First published in 1815. The Assyrian came down like the wolf on the fold, and his cohorts with Egypt, and paid a ransom, and he prayed. And his prayer was heard by God. Now, Lord Byron wrote a poem called The Destruction of Sennacherib. And I'm going to try not to read it all, but it is good stuff. Here it is. First published in 1815. The Assyrian came down like the wolf on the fold, and his cohorts were gleaming in purple and gold. And the sheen of their spears was like stars on the sea when the blue wave rolls nightly on deep Galilee. Like the leaves of the forest when summer is green, that host with their banners at sunset were seen. Like the leaves of the forest when autumn hath blown, the host on the morrow lay withered and strown. For the angel of death spread his wings on the blast, and breathed in the face of the foe as he passed, and the eyes of the sleepers waxed deadly and chill, and their hearts that once heaved and forever grew still. And there lay the steed with his nostrils all wide, but through it there rolled not the breath of his pride, and the foam of his gasping lay white on the turf, and cold as the spray of the rock-beating surf. And there lay the rider, distorted and pale, with the dew on his brow, and the rust on his mail, and the tents were all silent, the banners alone, the lances unlifted, the trumpet unblown. And the widows of Asher are loud in their wail, and the idols are broke in the temple of Baal. And the might of the Gentile, unsmote by the sword, hath melted like snow in the glance of the Lord. Why did God wipe out the Assyrian army? Indeed, the people enjoyed that victory, but they slipped yet again. And so God spoke through Isaiah and said, "Behold, another army is coming." And the Babylonian army came under King Nebuchadnezzar and took their people into exile. And God's answer to their prayers at that time was, "Don't worry, another army is coming to deal with the Babylonians." And so the Persians and the Medes swept through with Cyrus, the beginning of the exile. There are bits of archaeology that speak to these. There's Sennacherib's stele. It's a clay pillar with writing on it that talks about Sennacherib's battle, and of course he has a much more positive view that they withdrew with tribute, where the Bible's account differs and says, no, the angel of death destroyed and wiped out the Assyrian army. There's history in here, there's prophecy, and there's relevance. Do we believe in the God of the Old Testament? How can we understand a God who loves us, who sacrifices his word made flesh, his son? How can we understand the depth of that love unless we understand the depth of God's anger. Surely we need to understand God's wrath of the Old Testament to realise how great and deep is his love and mercy. In Isaiah, we have the pictures to come of his call, and we'll study that next week, and that'll be here at Petton at 9:30 and then at Bampton at 11. We'll also study the words of comfort to Jerusalem, how the corrupt city will be raised up again. We'll hear about the servant songs of Isaiah, where he talks about a perfect servant who will be righteous and bring righteousness, but how he will suffer. Doesn't that sound familiar to you, the suffering servant? Our study through Isaiah, I hope, will remind us of how important the Old Testament is to our faith, that it is relevant in our times of news constantly, of a world that's suffering, a world that is looking for salvation, hope, and faith from each of us. So that we may, as it says in the Book of Common Prayer, do all such good works as thou hast prepared for us